A Florida law aimed at getting kids off social media is technically now in effect, but it's not yet enforceable as it's being challenged in the courts. CBS News Miami's Yvonne Taylor explains the law, why it's being challenged, and what parents think about it.
Alex Goldsmith is very vocal about a state law that prevents teenagers from having or opening social media accounts.
I don't agree with that. I think everyone should be able to have social media.
This 16-year-old tells me teenagers not only use social media to explore the unknown, which is some parents' biggest fear and the premise of the law.
But some people use social media to like communicate with their friends and stuff. So I think it's nice to have.
His dad supported him wholeheartedly.
I agree with everything he said. He's very responsible. We're not worried about him on social media.
The social media restrictions were part of Florida House Bill 3, signed into law by Governor Ron DeSantis in March of 2024. It requires platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, among others, to terminate certain accounts and provide additional options for termination of such accounts.
Of course, absolutely.
Albany Guerra, mother of a teenager, sees the new law as a ray of light.
She's against it, but like all teenagers, they find a way.
She encourages ongoing supervision, especially because social media companies may not immediately kick teenagers off their platforms. In fact, the state will not legally enforce the law until at least February, because there are 2 lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the restrictions.
I'm 17, and I get how parents, adults would get that 14-year-olds don't have to be on social media.
Angel and his sister Damaris agree with the change.
Because more exposure to social media can increase their mental explorations of bad things.
Neil Goldsmith says it's about supervision. He told me if Alex was 15, he would not restrict him from social media.
He's got my permission. He's got his mom's permission.
So if the law becomes enforceable, social media companies could actually be subject to penalties if they don't restrict teenagers from their sites. And that could include a $50,000 penalty per violation. We're in Doral. Yvonne Taylor, CBS News, Miami.
Parents and lawmakers have had their say, but what's the science behind these age restrictions? We spoke to Dr. Daniel Bober, a psychiatrist specializing in mental illness and addiction with Memorial Health System, for a deeper dive. Dr. Bober, thanks so much for joining us. Now, we just heard from parents about their stance on social media for their kids. Some say they're comfortable with it. It's okay. Others, though, do have their reservations. I find it depends a lot on the age of their children. So let's break it down, beginning with that age threshold. The law bans kids under 14 from having social media accounts, and kids 14 or 15 will need parental consent. So what's the science behind those ages? Is there a science? As an expert, what is too young for kids to be on social media?
Well, we generally recommend that kids 2 years or younger have no screen time whatsoever. We know, for example, that kids should not have more than an hour of screen time, and we know that after an hour of screen time, the risk of mental illness increases, and then finally at the 3-hour mark, the risk of mental illness more than doubles. This is a tricky topic because social media in and of itself is not all bad. There are definitely some things about social media that can foster positive relationships in kids. But what we do know is that in children, the amount of screen time, the frequency, and the number of platforms increases with mental illness. There is definitely an association between those 3 things. And we know that social media can increase the risk of depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, problems with body image, increased eating disordered behavior, and social anxiety. So again, while there's not a cause and effect relationship, it does seem to be the fuel on the fire.
You mentioned those screen time limits, obviously starting as young as 2 years old, or from newborns to 2 years old. No screens at all is really what's recommended. But, you know, in this day and age, we see a lot of, toddlers and younger kids with those iPads. They're not on social media, but yeah, they are seeing things on screens. So how is that potentially negatively impacting them? What are some of the, mental health issues just from simply being on a screen all day that you're seeing in children?
Well, it really depends on the content, right? So some of the educational content can actually be beneficial. But look at what's happened the last 20 years, right? We see double the rates of obesity, kids on social media, on screens that are much more sedentary, and you combine that with a poor diet, and the rate of obesity in children and adolescents is almost 20%. An increased risk of suicide from 2007 on, the risk of suicide increased 62%. So there are some real public health implications to being on the screen, but it does depend, again, what content is being viewed on these screens.
Let's say kids are on social media. Let's say their parents set them up, with an Instagram or a Facebook account, TikTok, what have you. And there are comments out there. Kids are seeing these things. Is that really the main issue, that kids are being, their eyes are being opened up to potentially negative comments, and that could hurt their self-esteem? And that's where we're seeing these suicide rates increasing by leaps and bounds over the last decade?
Well, I definitely think social media is part of the problem. But, I have a little bit of a skewed perception because I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So I always see the worst outcomes. I have kids in my office that are on social media where some of the platforms are teaching them how to self-harm or cut themselves or burn themselves, or talking about the most efficient way to commit suicide. So I'm seeing the worst outcomes. But yes, I do agree that some of these social media platforms are highly reinforcing. And we know that the development of the brain, particularly around the time of 10 to 19 years of age, is a particularly sensitive time for emotional regulation, for impulse control, for learning, and other types of behavior. And we know that children and adolescents have a brain that seeks out novel experiences, that has difficulty weighing the future consequences of its actions, and fails to control its impulses. So in a way, this is really the perfect storm for their stage in brain development.
As parents, of course, we want to know, what can we be doing? How can we help our kids navigate this new world that we didn't have to deal with as kids? I couldn't get on social media as a child because it didn't exist in the capacity that it does now. So what are some of the warning signs that parents should be looking out for?
So obviously, limiting screen time, trying to keep these devices out of the bedroom at night, particularly when they're supposed to be sleeping, keeping it away from the dinner table, trying to delay the use of social media and smartphones as long as possible. That is, I think, a key point to all this.
And Doctor, I have a question. I mean, as my phone is right next to me right now, is part of the problem also that our kids see us on our own devices? So we kind of have to, as adults, take a stand as well and maybe spend less screen time, less time on social media, and be the example that these kids need?
Yes, absolutely. Children model their parents' behavior. And so if you as a parent are always on your phone, if you're at the dinner table or in family events where you're supposed to be present and you're always on your phone, that sets a very poor example for kids. And I do think that these phones and these social media platforms have behavioral algorithms that are highly reinforcing. And we see addiction or addictive-like behaviors from the phones. And particularly when the phones or the social media platforms are withdrawn from people, they have increasing episodes of anxiety. So there is an addictive or an addiction-like component to it.
So getting to this law here in the state of Florida, based on what you've been telling me and explaining, it sounds like you are, in fact, perhaps in favor of some sort of legislation that sort of polices the use of social media and even screen time for kids 14 and under. Do you think that that's a good thing that needs to be going into effect this year?
A lot of critics will say that it violates free speech. A lot of critics will say it's not a good idea, but I will tell you this. Over 2/3 of parents are not using parental controls on these devices. So they're not doing the job. So we need something from a public health perspective to try to control what's happening. And so I do agree that this bill is a good idea. I think it's going to take us in a positive direction. Obviously, kids who are 14 or 15 can use social media with parental consent. But I do think kids, particularly at a young age, and particularly younger girls, are particularly vulnerable to the effects of social media. So I do think that this is a net positive.
Yeah, not just about parental consent, needs that parental oversight as well. Right now, though, there's some legal challenges to the law, but let's say it becomes enforceable after the challenges and kids are banned from social media. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but could there be negative ramifications for that? Because for some kids, social media provides some much needed connection. So could losing that connection also be a problem for them?
You know what, Lauren? What did we do before social media? Somehow we found a way to be connected. And what has social media done for us? Social media began in the late 90s. And again, during that period of time, we had massive increases in obesity. We had massive increases in suicide rates. So I'm not suggesting that that's the fault of social media, but I'm saying that maybe we as a society need to find a way to be connected without the use of social media. And I do think that there are, again, some positive things to say about social media. There are some benefits in terms of the connections that young people will make. But what I see is a lot of damage. And so I think this is a good first start. We can try it and see how it goes, and we can always change course if we need to.
In the meantime, though, what conversation should parents be having with their kids about responsible use of technology and social media? What can they say? Do you give these parents advice?
I would say that they could talk to them about some of the research that's been out there that shows that increased screen time definitely can have a negative effect on their mental health, and that we as parents are just trying to help you make healthy choices. And we're here. It's important to keep an open line of communication. And I think that is really one of the most challenging things I see as a child psychiatrist is a lot of parents don't have an open line of communication with their kids. Mm-hmm. They're not communicating with them. They're not explaining why they're doing things. And I think if you can have that connection with your child and be present, I think that's essential.
Yeah, and I find giving an alternative helps too. If my son wants to play his video games, I'm like, hey, wait, let's do something else. Let's, do a puzzle. Let's go outside. Let's read a book. Give him something else to do so he can't say, but I'm bored. So that certainly does help as well.
Go outside, throw a football, spend time with them. Because again, then they're getting the exercise and then they're getting off the grid. And that's a double positive right there.
Absolutely. Dr. Bober, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back with a final look at other new laws that just took effect this week.